we explore Somali's unique genetic story, colonialism's echoes, ancient trade routes, and the vibrant mix of cultures. Discover how these historical forces shape the health, identity, and heritage of the Somali people. Witness how trade enriched gene pools, blending ancestries. Today, this legacy lives on in their DNA. These men sometimes formed temporary or long-term relationships with local women, leading to mixed ancestry offspring whose identities were shaped as much by colonial hierarchies as by cultural affiliation. The impact of these unions went beyond DNA. Mixed heritage individuals often found themselves caught between social strata, sometimes marginalized by both African and European communities. Oral histories collected from families in Djibouti's Quartier Européen and the Balbala district tell of children with French fathers who were left behind when their colonial parents returned home. These children, and their children in turn, carried both the physical and genetic legacies of a fractured colonial past. Colonial rule also influenced health profiles in the region, introduced diseases such as tuberculosis, typhoid, and venereal infections left long-lasting effects. In response, the population underwent both cultural and biological adaptation. Certain immune response genes in Djiboutian populations show increased activity, perhaps shaped by exposure to these new pathogens during the colonial era. Genome-wide studies suggest that selection pressures during this period may have altered gene expression linked to immunity and inflammation. French colonial medical practices, while often exploitative, also contributed to early documentation of genetic traits. Reports from the 1930s and 1940s noted blood disorders like sickle cell anemia and G6PD deficiency among local populations. Today, researchers are revisiting these records alongside genetic data to explore how colonial-era population shifts influenced the distribution of inherited conditions in Djibouti. Language and identity were also affected. Linguistic shifts can influence genetic studies too, as language often correlates with social structure, marriage patterns, and mobility, all factors that shape gene flow. Perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of colonial influence is how it reshaped migration patterns. The French colonial presence linked Djibouti more tightly to other colonies than to its immediate African neighbors. This created a unique genetic corridor. Djiboutians migrated to Madagascar, Reunion, and France, while people from those areas also moved into Djibouti. These exchanges subtly diversified the genetic landscape, creating markers that might otherwise seem out of place in an East African setting. Despite this, the core genetic structure of Djiboutian populations remained remarkably resilient. The dominant Afro-Asiatic and Cushitic lineages persist in high frequencies, especially in rural and nomadic communities less affected by urban colonial dynamics. This speaks to the strength of local continuity, even in the face of empire. Today, as genetic science continues to unravel these hidden legacies, a more nuanced picture emerges. Colonialism, often discussed only in political or economic terms, also left molecular echoes. These are not always visible, but they shape the health, identity, and heritage of people living today. In examining Djibouti's colonial shadows through the genome, we find a story of interruption, but not erasure. The genes speak not only of foreign incursion, but of how communities adapted, absorbed, and endured. In doing so, they remind us that even the most powerful empires leave traces that fade, not disappear, carried quietly in the code of life itself. Long before colonial railways and shipping ports altered Djibouti's map, an older and quieter economy pulsed through its harsh terrain, the trade of salt. Carved from the blinding white flats of Lake Assal, salt was Djibouti's white gold. It moved not just in baskets on camelback, but across human generations, linking inland deserts to coastal ports and distant kingdoms beyond the Red Sea. In its trail, salt left something more than commerce. It left a genetic legacy. For centuries, caravans of Afar nomads transported slabs of salt from the crystalline bed of Lake Assal, one of the saltiest and lowest points on Earth. The route these caravans followed, known to historians and locals as the Salt Roads, stretched from the lakeside plains through Djibouti's interior to coastal towns and eventually into Ethiopia and Arabia. At each stop, exchanges occurred of goods, languages, customs, and genes. Genetic studies among modern Djibouti and populations along these ancient trade corridors reveal subtle patterns of admixture that mirror these historic salt routes. Mitochondrial DNA in particular shows evidence of maternal lineages originating from both highland Ethiopia and southern Arabia, appearing in coastal Djiboutian families at higher than average frequencies. These are not dominant lineages, but they appear too regularly and in just the right places to be coincidental. What this suggests is that trade was more than economic. It was social. When caravans rested in villages or coastal ports, they often stayed for weeks, sometimes months. Relationships formed, some temporary, others enduring. Children born of such unions carried the genetic legacy of trade networks that had no borders. With each salt-laden journey, gene flow followed the rhythm of the camel's hooves. Y chromosome data adds further weight to this narrative. Among Afar and Isa populations along the old trade routes, markers such as E1, V2, and J1 occur in tandem. The former is common among Cushitic-speaking nomads, while the latter is more frequent in southern Arabia. Their co-presence suggests historical male-mediated gene flow through these trade connections. Traders from Arabia or Ethiopia may have settled, intermarried, or left children whose descendants still carry their markers today. Autosomal DNA mapping also reveals a fascinating convergence along the salt routes. In inland regions near Lake Assal, genetic profiles lean heavily toward East African ancestry. But as one traces the path toward the coast, a gradual increase in West Asian components emerges. This clinal gradient indicates a historical funnel of genetic blending, beginning in the remote salt mines and culminating in coastal towns where trade reached its zenith. Beyond DNA, this story is echoed in oral traditions and clan histories. Families in the Tajira and Obok regions often recount ancestors who came from across the water or the highlands and settled after working in trade. While these tales were long viewed as folklore, they now align closely with what is seen in the genome. Genetic memory and cultural memory, once separate, are being stitched together. Even in the trade's logistics, genetic exchange was built in. Salt caravans often hired guards, guides, and camel drivers from different ethnic backgrounds. As these multicultural teams worked together over months of travel, bonds formed. It was not unusual for nomads to take wives from trading towns or for merchant daughters to marry caravan leaders. Over time, these unions created families that straddled the cultural and genetic line between nomadic and settled life. One surprising aspect of salt trade's genetic legacy is how it influenced disease resistance. Populations that lived or worked along the salt roads often had prolonged exposure to dehydration, physical stress, and microbial contamination in trade hubs. Geneticists now believe that certain immune system gene variants found in these populations may have been positively selected in response to these harsh conditions. These include genes related to water retention, sodium regulation, and skin barrier function. Anthropologists have also noted that dietary adaptations may have played a role. The high salt content in local diets, combined with a lifestyle of constant motion, likely influence metabolic pathways. Some of these changes are observable in genetic predispositions for blood pressure regulation and cardiovascular function among Djiboutian populations today. In essence, the very act of carrying salt shaped the bodies and genes of those who did it. As the salt trade declined with the advent of modern transportation, many of these genetic patterns began to stabilize, but the legacy remains. Genetic data collected from villages that once thrived along the salt routes show greater heterogeneity than those located far from historical trade paths. This suggests that trade wasn't just about enriching markets. It was about enriching gene pools, blending ancestries in ways that still shape the population centuries later. Today, Lake Assal still gleams under the desert sun, and camels can still be seen on the horizon. But the ancient salt roads are quiet. Their story, however, lives on in Djiboutian DNA. Each strand carries whispers of the past, of salt traders from the highlands, port workers from Arabia, and nomads whose lives were shaped by commerce and kinship. In studying the genetic map laid over the salt roads, we uncover a new understanding of mobility and identity. Djibouti's people are not isolated remnants of history, but living legacies of movement, drawn together by a mineral that once moved mountains and by the invisible code that remembers every step along the way. Perched at the mouth of the Red Sea, Djibouti has long been more than just a geographic crossroads. It is a maritime threshold, an ancient port of entry between Africa and the world. While modern cargo ships now crowd the Gulf of Tajura, their roots echo those of earlier vessels that carried spices, incense, and humans across oceans. The harbors of Djibouti were never just docking points. They were genetic melting pots where every tide brought new blood. Centuries before European empires drew borders or established protectorates, seafaring merchants from India, Persia, the Arabian Peninsula, and even Southeast Asia sailed into Djibouti's natural bays. These merchants didn't just trade goods. They married into local families, settled temporarily or permanently, and left genetic traces that are still detectable in the modern population. Genomic analysis of coastal communities in Djibouti shows a slightly different composition compared to their inland counterparts. Along the coast, particularly in Djibouti City, Tijura, and Obok, DNA studies reveal elevated levels of South Asian, Persian, and Southeast Arabian ancestry. These aren't recent additions. They reflect ancient admixture events that likely began over 2 millennia ago during the height of the Indian Ocean trade. This maritime contact was especially strong between the 1st century BCE and the 7th century CE, when the Horn of Africa played a critical role in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade networks.